A mafia boss bought a girl for $500, but it wasn't the money that changed everything. It was what she asked him to do next. Something so quiet, so broken, that it brought a man who'd ordered killings without blinking to his knees in tears. His name was Ezra Valenti, 37, the head of one of Chicago's most feared crime families, the kind of man whose voice didn't need volume because entire rooms went silent the moment he walked in. He hadn't shed a single tear in 8 years, not since the night his 19-year-old sister Petra was found dead in a shipping container at the port, pulled from a trafficking ring he'd been too late to stop. That guilt turned him into something that looked like power, but felt like a slow death from the inside out. She was 27, though the hollows under her eyes made her look like she'd already lived a lifetime most people couldn't survive. Noelle Ashford, a former medical student kidnapped from a hospital parking lot in Portland 14 months ago, sold through 4 different hands, and caged, literally caged, in a steel kennel at a black market where men paid to touch what they'd never earned the right to look at. He wasn't looking for her. He was walking through that market on business when he heard something that stopped him cold. Not a scream, but the absence of one. The kind of silence that only comes after a person's used up their last breath. He saw 3 men reaching through the bars, laughing, grabbing at a woman who'd stopped fighting back, and something cracked behind his ribs, because the girl in that cage looked exactly like the ghost he'd been carrying for 8 years. He didn't pull a gun. He walked up, threw $500 in the dirt at their feet, every dollar he had on him, and said something that made the tallest one's face go pale. What happened after that? The secret locked in her memory, the powerful men who'd kill to keep her silent, the betrayal from inside his own ranks, and the one quiet request she made that shattered every wall he'd built. That's a story you won't forget. If stories about broken people finding the courage to save each other still mean something to you, you're in the right place. Hit that like button so this story finds someone who needs it tonight. Share it with someone who thinks people can't change, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that black market in Southside Chicago, to the moment Ezra Valenti looked into a cage and saw his dead sister's eyes staring back at him. Ezra Valenti stood before the iron cage, his eyes never leaving the tallest man among the 3 of them, the one with a scar running from his ear down to his jaw, Jonah Pruitt. 5 bills of $100 each lay in the dirt beneath Jonah's feet, but he didn't pick them up, not yet, because he was trying to read the face of the man standing in front of him. Ezra didn't speak loudly. He had never needed to speak loudly. His voice was only just loud enough to be heard over the noise of the black market, but it carried a weight that made the other 2 men automatically step back behind Jonah. 500. That's all your life is worth to me. Pick up the money, open the cage, then get lost, before I change my mind and decide that $500 buys a bullet at a better bargain. Jonah looked into Ezra's eyes and realized who he was looking at. Everyone on the South Side knew the Valenti name, knew that people who angered this crime lord usually didn't live long enough to tell the story. Greed wrestled with fear inside Jonah, and like every coward in the world, he chose the option with money right in front of him and death one step farther away. He bent down, picked up the money with his filthy fingers, shoved it quickly into his jacket pocket, then unlocked the cage. The iron door opened with a rusty creak, but the girl inside didn't move. Noelle Ashford sat curled in the corner of the cage, both arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes open but empty, staring through the open door as though it meant nothing at all. 14 months of captivity had taught her that an open door never meant freedom. It only meant someone new had arrived. New hands, new pain. Ezra looked at her and felt something twist inside his chest, because the way she sat there, the way she folded herself into the smallest shape possible as though she wanted to disappear, was exactly the posture he had imagined thousands of times when he thought of Petra during sleepless nights. He bent down slowly, deliberately letting her see every movement, not hurried, not threatening, then held out his hand. "I didn't buy you," he said, his voice softer than anyone who had ever heard Ezra Valenti speak could have imagined. "I bought the door. Whether you want to step through it or not is your decision." Noelle looked at his hand. She flinched, by reflex, the kind of flinch belonging to someone who had been touched too many times by hands that never asked permission. But there was something in this man's voice, not gentleness, but the complete absence of desire, that made her slowly place her ice-cold fingers into his palm. He pulled her to her feet, gently, and she nearly fell because her legs had forgotten how to stand straight after too many months curled inside a cramped space. Ezra led her through the black market, past stalls selling guns and drugs, past the curious and frightened eyes of people who knew his face. No one dared say a word. At the end of the street, a black car was parked in the darkness, and Gideon Hale was leaning against the car door with his arms crossed over his chest. Gideon was 41 years old, with 15 years beside Ezra, since the crime lord had still been a 22-year-old kid running errands for the old family. Gideon knew Ezra better than anyone else in the world, and precisely because of that, his face hardened at once when he saw Ezra leading a ragged girl so thin that her shoulder bones rose beneath the thin fabric. "No," Gideon said immediately, his voice low and firm. "Ezra, no. Bringing a stranger into the inner circle violates every rule you set yourself. Who is she? Where did she come from? Who does she work for?" Ezra opened the rear door and gently guided Noelle inside. She folded herself into the corner of the seat, drew her knees up to her chest, and stared down at the floor of the car. Ezra closed the door, looked at Gideon, and said nothing. No explanation, no justification, only one look. A look that after 15 years Gideon had learned how to read. A look saying this argument had ended before it began. Gideon shook his head, pressed his lips together, then got into the driver's seat. The car left the south side in complete silence. No music, no conversation, no questions. Only Noelle's faint, broken breathing in the back seat, the windshield wipers sweeping the night drizzle from the glass, and the heavy silence between the two men in the front seats, both of them knowing that tonight had changed something that couldn't be taken back. 30 minutes later, the car stopped in front of a high-rise building in the Gold Coast, where elegant lights reflected across wet glass, only 15 miles from the black market, but a whole world away. Ezra Valenti's penthouse sat on the 40th floor, overlooking Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling panes of glass, where at night the city lights stretched below like a glowing carpet, and the black surface of the lake blended into the sky, giving the feeling of standing at the edge of the world. The apartment was spacious, clean, and cold, everything made of marble and steel and glass, with no family photographs on the walls, no sign that an actual human being lived here instead of merely existing. Ezra called Celeste Navarro over within 20 minutes. Celeste was the Valenti family's underground doctor, 39 years old, once a surgeon at Northwestern Hospital, before a staged medical malpractice lawsuit pushed her out of the profession, and Ezra was the one who had given her a place to keep doing what she did best. Celeste didn't ask why there was a skeletal girl sitting trembling on the sofa in a mafia boss's penthouse. She simply opened her medical bag and began the examination. Noelle didn't resist when Celeste touched her, but her body reacted in the way only people who had been touched too many times without being asked reacted. Every time Celeste's fingers moved to a new area, she held her breath and closed her eyes, as though preparing herself for the next pain. Celeste took notes in silence, then stepped out into the hallway where Ezra was waiting. 2 broken ribs, healed, but healed wrong because they were never treated, Celeste said. Her voice kept professionally even, though her eyes were not. At least 7 cigarette burns on her arms and back. Severe malnutrition, anemia, dehydration, signs of prolonged abuse, both physical and... Celeste stopped, looked at Ezra, then only shook her head once. She didn't need to finish the sentence. That shake of her head contained everything medical language didn't want to name, and Ezra understood every ounce of its weight. His jaw tightened, not from an anger that exploded outward, but from the kind of anger that had crystallized into something harder, colder, something he would keep and use later. Celeste gave Noelle pain medication, started an IV, then guided her into the bathroom. Noelle stood under the hot water for nearly 40 minutes, so long that Celeste had to knock on the door to make sure she was still conscious. When she came out, dressed in clean clothes Celeste had found in Ezra's closet, an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants whose cuffs had to be folded 3 times. She looked like a child wearing an adult's clothes. Celeste left after giving Ezra instructions about medication and nutrition, leaving the 2 of them in a penthouse so quiet they could hear the wind striking the glass on the 40th floor. Noelle sat in the corner of the living room, on the floor rather than on the chair, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, wrapped in Ezra's coat, which he had placed over the back of the chair near where she sat without saying anything. The coat covered almost her entire body, emphasizing her fragile silhouette against the stark, overwhelming vastness of a penthouse larger than the apartments where most people in Chicago spent their whole lives. Ezra sat in the chair across from her, about 3 meters away, no closer. He didn't turn on the television, didn't play music, didn't try to fill the silence with anything at all. After a long while, Noelle spoke without looking at him. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice hoarse from months of not speaking in complete sentences. "But whatever it is, I don't have it to give." "I don't want anything from you," Ezra answered. Noelle lifted her head and looked at him for the first time since they had left the black market, and there was no gratitude in her eyes, no relief, only suspicion sharpened over 14 months of being betrayed by every hand that had ever promised it wouldn't hurt her. "Every man says that," she said. "Then they come asking for it at night." The sentence hung in the air between them, heavier than any accusation Ezra had ever heard in his life, and he had heard many. He didn't deny it, didn't make promises, didn't try to convince her, because he knew words had no value to someone who had been betrayed by words too many times. The silence stretched on. The night wind hissed outside the glass. Then Ezra spoke, his voice so low that Noelle had to lean forward to hear him clearly. "I once had a younger sister. Her name was Petra. She was 19 when she was locked inside something just like that cage. I looked for her. I turned this whole city upside down, but I didn't find her in time." He said nothing more. He didn't explain how Petra died, where or who was responsible. Only that much. And the absence of the rest said more than any long story ever could. Noelle looked at him, and for the first time since the cage door had opened, she saw something on this man's face besides danger. A crack, small but deep enough for her to see that behind the mafia boss's cold granite surface was an older brother, still searching for his sister, in the face of every girl locked inside a cage. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't ready for that. But she didn't turn away anymore. While Noelle slept in the corner of the 40th floor penthouse, curled inside Ezra's coat like a small animal that had just escaped a trap, but still didn't believe the forest was safe, across the city, Jonah Pruitt was making a phone call he both feared and couldn't avoid making. Conrad Voss answered after the second ring. Conrad was 52 years old, the owner of a boutique hotel chain stretching across the Great Lakes region, a man who appeared in Chicago business magazines with the smile of a philanthropist, the kind of person who shook the mayor's hand in the morning and ordered someone killed at night without changing the rhythm of his heartbeat. Jonah told him what had happened at the black market, his voice trying to stay calm but stumbling every time he mentioned the name Valenti. "He bought the girl. $500. I had no way to refuse, Mr. Voss. You know who Valenti is." Conrad didn't care about $500. That amount wasn't enough to pay for his dinner at Alinea. What made him set his glass of whiskey down on the table and sit up straight was one simple but deadly fact. Noelle Ashford had been inside his network for 14 months. 14 months moved through 3 different warehouses, 14 months inside the same system as dozens of other girls, 14 months hearing people's names, seeing people's faces, memorizing locations and schedules with the mind of a medical student trained to observe details she herself probably hadn't even realized how much she had retained. That girl wasn't lost merchandise. She was a ticking bomb, and now that bomb was in the hands of a mafia boss Conrad couldn't control. "Find the girl," Conrad said, his voice as flat as Lake Michigan on a windless day, the kind of stillness with whirlpools beneath it that could drag a ship under. "Bring her back. Alive is better. Dead is acceptable. But if she gets to the FBI before you find her, then the next person dead will be you." Conrad hung up and called another number. Yuri Fedorov answered but said nothing, only waited. Yuri was 38 years old, Russian, and had come to Chicago 12 years earlier on a tourist visa and never left. He never spoke more than necessary, never left more trace than required, and in Chicago's underworld, he was known not by his name, but by his results. The people Conrad wanted to disappear disappeared. Cleanly, quietly, efficiently. Conrad said only 2 sentences, the girl's name and the name of the man keeping her. Yuri hung up without saying a single word. But Conrad Voss and Yuri Fedorov were not the only people looking toward the Gold Coast penthouse that night. 6 blocks away, inside a short-term rental apartment on the 12th floor, FBI Special Agent Walsh Carrick was sitting in front of 4 screens, displaying footage from the surveillance cameras his team had installed around Ezra's building over the past 3 months. Carrick was 44 years old, with 20 years in the FBI, commanding a long-running operation targeting organized crime in Chicago, and both Ezra Valenti and Conrad Voss were on the whiteboard in his conference room, with red strings connecting their portraits to organizational charts. Carrick didn't yet know the details of what had happened that night at the black market, but his surveillance team had recorded Ezra Valenti returning to the penthouse at 11:47 at night, with an unidentified woman, and Celeste Navarro, the Valenti family's private doctor, had arrived and left within the following 2 hours. Carrick marked the event in red pen in the surveillance log and wrote, "New female subject. Identity needed." Navarro called in urgently, meaning injury or medical situation. Continue monitoring. He didn't yet know that the unidentified girl sitting inside Ezra Valenti's penthouse that night would become the most important piece in his entire career. The next morning, inside the private office behind the family restaurant in Little Italy, Gideon Hale set a cup of coffee in front of Ezra and stood on the other side of the desk, not sitting down, because what he was about to say needed to be said standing. "I've followed you for 15 years, Gideon began. "I've never asked why when you ordered someone killed. I've never asked why when you burned Morello's warehouse, or when you bought an entire block in Bridgeport. But last night you brought a girl with an unknown background into your own home. You let the family doctor examine her, and this morning she's still there. You're dragging the entire Valenti family into a war because of a girl you don't know." "I know," Ezra said, his eyes lowered to the cup of coffee. "Then why?" Gideon asked. Ezra didn't answer. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer was a name he could no longer say aloud. Not because he had forgotten it, but because every time he spoke it, it still cut into his throat the way it had on the first day. Gideon looked at that silence, and he understood. Because he was one of the very few people in the world who knew about Petra Valenti, and knew what that name had done to the man sitting in front of him. He didn't ask again. He only picked up his own cup of coffee, took a sip, and said, "Then you should prepare. Because whatever your reason is, Conrad Voss will come to claim that girl, and he won't come alone." 3 days passed inside the 40th floor penthouse, and Noelle Ashford began to speak. Not because she trusted Ezra Valenti, not because she felt safe, but because after 14 months locked in darkness, she had carried too many things inside her, and there was no room left to keep them anymore. She didn't speak to Ezra, not yet, because her survival instinct still refused to trust any man completely, even one who had thrown $500 onto the ground to open the door of her cage. The person she chose to speak to was Celeste Navarro, because Celeste was a woman, because Celeste's hands, whenever she examined her, always stopped and asked before touching a new place, and because in Celeste's eyes there was something Noelle recognized, not pity, but anger on her behalf. The kind of anger one woman feels when she sees what men have done to another woman and wants someone to pay for it. Celeste came every day to monitor Noelle's health, and during those examinations, between medical questions about pain and sleep, Noelle began to tell her story. She told it in pieces, out of order, like someone gathering the shards of a broken mirror and handing each piece to Celeste one at a time. Celeste listened, took notes, and every evening after leaving the penthouse, she relayed it to Ezra, not through written records but in spoken words, because she knew what Noelle was telling her shouldn't exist on paper until it was in the right place. And what Noelle told her kept Celeste from sleeping, while Ezra sat motionless in his office for 2 full hours after hearing it. Noelle remembered the names of 12 other girls still alive inside Conrad Voss's network. 12 names, 12 faces, 12 stories she had heard in the dark, when the girls whispered to one another, through the thin partitions between their cells. She remembered the addresses of 3 warehouses where she had been held, one in back of the yards, one near the abandoned industrial district in Gary, Indiana, and one right in the Calumet Harbor area, where twice a month trucks came at night to move the merchandise. She remembered the license plates of at least 4 trucks, remembered that the transfer schedule usually fell on Tuesday and Friday nights, remembered that the guards always changed shifts at 3 o'clock in the morning because that was when they thought no one was watching. The memory of a final-year medical student, trained for 4 years to observe symptoms, record details, and distinguish the smallest differences between patterns, had turned Noelle into something she didn't even realize she had become. A living ledger, recording every crime her eyes had seen and her ears had heard, with such precision that any federal prosecutor would have traded an entire career to put her on the witness stand. But the most dangerous information was not the names of the girls or the addresses of the warehouses. The most dangerous information was a face. One night, about 4 months before Ezra bought her out of that cage, Noelle was transferred to the warehouse at Calumet Harbor. That night there was a special visitor, a silver-haired man in a suit, personally let in by Conrad Voss and addressed as Judge. Noelle saw that man's face through the gap between the partition boards, and her medically trained mind recorded every detail. The mole on his left eyelid, the gold ring engraved with initials on his ring finger, the deep voice, with the distinctive tone of someone raised in New England. When Celeste described this detail to Ezra, he took out his phone and searched, and within 30 seconds, he was looking at that face on the website of the federal court for the Northern District of Illinois. Judge Beau Whitmore, 61 years old, appointed for life. The man who had signed orders dismissing at least 4 investigations connected to human trafficking in the Great Lakes region over the past 3 years. Ezra set the phone down and looked out the window, where Lake Michigan stretched beneath the gray afternoon light. He realized that the $500 he had thrown into the dirt at the black market had not merely bought a girl out of a cage. He had bought a bomb, with the power to bring down Conrad Voss's entire empire, drag a federal judge down with it, and collapse the largest human trafficking network in the Great Lakes region. But that bomb had 2 sides. If Noelle went to the FBI with what she knew, the FBI wouldn't investigate only Conrad Voss. They would investigate everything surrounding the incident, including the question of why a mafia boss had been present at the black market that night and why the girl was sitting in his penthouse. The thread would pull from Conrad to Noelle, from Noelle to Ezra, and from Ezra to the entire Valenti empire he had spent 15 years building. Protecting Noelle Ashford could mean destroying with his own hands everything he had ever been. Ezra sat alone in his office, looking at the only photograph he kept of Petra, a tiny picture the size of a matchbox hidden inside a locked drawer, taken on her 16th birthday, her smile wide, her eyes bright, knowing nothing yet about the darkness waiting for her 3 years later. He looked at the photograph, then looked toward the living room where Noelle was sitting with the old medical book Celeste had brought her, the first book she had touched after 14 months, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages, because she was remembering who she had been before the world stole her. Ezra closed the drawer. He didn't yet know what he would choose, but he knew that this time, he wouldn't arrive too late. On the 4th night in the penthouse, Noelle couldn't sleep. She hadn't slept through a single night since she arrived here, but tonight was worse because Celeste had lowered the dose of sedatives, and Noelle's mind had nothing left to block the images waiting behind her closed eyelids. She got up from the bed in the living room that Ezra had given her, while he slept in the office on the old leather sofa, and never stepped into the living room after 10 o'clock at night, a boundary he had set for himself without anyone needing to ask. She opened the glass door and stepped out onto the balcony, where the wind from Lake Michigan blew cold enough for her to feel that she was still alive, that her skin still knew the difference between heat and cold, that she wasn't the corpse the past 14 months had tried to turn her into. The city of Chicago stretched out below, millions of lights, millions of people sleeping inside warm homes, unaware that only a few miles away there were girls locked in warehouses and no one could hear them cry. Noelle didn't hear Ezra step out onto the balcony, but she knew he was there because the air changed. Not in a threatening way, but in the way she had slowly learned over the past 4 days, his presence heavy but not confining, like a wall blocking the wind rather than a wall holding her in. He stood about 3 meters away from her, leaning against the glass doorframe, holding 2 cups of coffee, and said nothing. He didn't ask if she was all right, because they both knew the answer. He didn't ask why she couldn't sleep, because he was awake at 3 o'clock in the morning too, and he had no right to ask anyone about sleep. They stood like that for a long while, in silence, listening to the wind and the sound of the city breathing beneath them. Then Noelle spoke, her eyes still fixed on the lake, not on him. "You kill people?" The question came without warning, but her voice didn't tremble, didn't sound afraid, didn't accuse. It simply wanted to know, as though she were asking a doctor about test results she suspected she already knew. "I do," Ezra answered. No justification, no explanation, no word like "but" added afterward. Just one single word falling into the night air and staying there, bare and exposed, for her to decide what to do with it. Noelle gave a slight nod, as though that answer confirmed something she had suspected but needed to hear with her own ears. "Do you regret it?" she asked next. Ezra was silent longer this time. He looked down at the cup of coffee in his hand, steam rising into the cold air, then said, "Some of the people, no. What I became in order to kill them? Yes." Noelle turned her head and looked at him for the first time since she had stepped out onto the balcony. In the dim light rising from the city below, she saw that his face was not the face of a mafia boss, not the face of a killer, but the face of a 37-year-old man who was tired, the kind of tiredness that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too heavy for too long. "Are you a bad man who wants to be good?" she said slowly. or a good man who got tired of pretending to be bad. Ezra looked at her, and in that moment, he wasn't looking at her as Petra's shadow, wasn't looking at her as a victim who needed saving, but as someone asking him the question he had been running from for 15 years. "I don't know anymore," he said. "Maybe that's why I bought you, because I thought if I could save you, maybe I'd find the answer." Noelle didn't smile. She hadn't smiled once since she arrived here, and maybe she hadn't smiled through all 14 months before that, but she didn't turn away either. She looked at him for another moment, then looked down at the 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Ezra stepped forward once, only once, then held the cup of coffee out to her, his arm fully extended to keep the distance, so she could take it without having to come any closer to him than she wanted. Noelle looked at the coffee, then at his hand, then she reached out and took it. Her fingers didn't jerk back. For the first time in 4 days, she accepted something from his hand, without her body reacting by shrinking away. It was a moment so small that if anyone else had been standing there watching, they wouldn't have noticed anything special, just a man handing coffee to a woman on a balcony at 3 o'clock in the morning. But for Noelle, who had learned to fold into herself every time a man's hand came near, taking a cup of coffee from Ezra Valenti's hand without flinching, was something larger than she could explain in words. She was beginning to separate him from all the men before him, not because he was good. He had just admitted he killed people, and didn't regret all of them, but because he was dangerous in a way that was never pointed at her. He was the first dangerous man she had ever stood beside without feeling threatened, and she didn't yet know what to do with that feeling, so she simply drank the coffee and stood looking at the city, 3 meters away from him, in silence, until the sky above Lake Michigan began to turn from black to gray. The call came the following afternoon, while Ezra was sitting in the office at the restaurant in Little Italy, reviewing the financial report Tristan Gould had sent over. His private phone vibrated, an unknown number. But Ezra knew who was calling before he picked up, because only one kind of person dared call directly into a number that only 4 people in the world knew. "I hear you bought my property." Conrad Voss's voice came through, smooth and calm, as though the 2 of them were discussing a bottle of wine at a charity dinner. "She's not property," Ezra replied. "Everything in this city has a price, Ezra. You know that better than anyone. I respect you, so I'll offer 10 times what you paid, $5,000. Transferred into any account you want, within 1 hour. No, 10,000. No." Silence stretched for 3 seconds, and when Conrad spoke again, the smoothness was gone, revealing what lay beneath it. The thing people who had heard this voice in this tone usually didn't live long enough to describe to anyone else. "Then I'll take her back for free. And I'll add a delivery fee in the blood of your people." Ezra hung up, not hurried, not angry, only setting the phone down on the desk with the calm of a man who had known this call would come from the night he threw money into the dirt at the black market. He called Gideon right afterward, and although Gideon still didn't agree with Ezra's decision, he was the most loyal man in the Valenti family, and when Ezra said, "Increase security at the penthouse, tonight," Gideon didn't ask anything more. He started making calls. That night, Ezra brought Noelle back to the penthouse earlier than usual. He didn't tell her about Conrad's call, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he saw her reading the medical book Celeste had brought, her fingers tracing each line with the concentration of someone trying to remember who she had once been, and he didn't want to take that moment away from her. 4 guards were stationed in the ground floor lobby, 2 in the hallway on the 40th floor, and Gideon personally sat in the underground parking garage with a pistol across his lap. But Conrad Voss wasn't the kind of man who sent a regular army to knock on the door. The 2 gunmen came through the building's rear maintenance stairwell at 11:43 at night, disabled the camera on the 39th floor with spray paint, and climbed to the 40th floor through the emergency exit. They weren't first-class assassins. Conrad was saving Yuri Fedorov for something more important. These were only 2 hired guns, sent to test the defenses, to measure the response, to send a message in blood. The first gunshot rang out at 11:51. Noelle was lying on the bed in the living room when she heard the sound, and her body reacted before her mind could process it. 14 months of survival instinct igniting in 1,000th of a second. She rolled off the bed and crawled into the bathroom, the smallest, darkest, most enclosed place she could find, because during the past 14 months she had learned that when there was a loud sound, you had to become as small as possible and pray they didn't find you. Gideon and the security team dealt with the 2 gunmen in less than 4 minutes. One was shot in the thigh and subdued in the hallway. The other jumped through a window on the 39th floor and fell onto the roof of the neighboring building, breaking both legs, lying there groaning until Gideon's men went down to collect him. When the gunfire ended, Ezra went looking for Noelle. He knew where she was before he opened the bathroom door, because that was where anyone who had ever been locked up would instinctively run. A small, closed space that could be locked from the inside, the only illusion of safety a panicked mind could hold on to. He opened the door and found her curled between the bathtub and the wall, both hands over her head, her whole body trembling, her eyes open, but not seeing the marble bathroom of the 40th floor penthouse. Her eyes were seeing the warehouse, seeing the cage, seeing hands reaching through iron bars, because traumatic memory doesn't care about reality. It drags you back to the old hell whenever it wants, and you don't get the right to refuse. Ezra didn't call her name. He didn't say, "You're safe now," because he knew those words meant nothing to someone in the middle of a flashback. He didn't touch her, because any touch in that moment would only pull her deeper into the memory. He only sat down on the bathroom floor, his back against the opposite wall, more than 1 meter away from her, and stayed still. No talking, no touching, no movement. Just sitting there, breathing evenly, letting his breath become the only steady thing in the room, a rhythm her subconscious could cling to in the middle of the storm inside her head. 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Noelle's trembling slowly grew smaller, from shaking through her whole body, to shaking in her shoulders, then to shaking in her fingers, then stopping completely. Her eyes gradually found focus again, returning from the warehouse in her memory to the real bathroom, where the light was soft, where expensive soap scented the air, and where a man sat quietly on the floor across from her, eyes open, not sleeping, not staring at her, but looking down at the floor, waiting, only waiting, asking nothing from her, not demanding that she be strong, not telling her to stop crying, not trying to fix her, only sitting there so she would know she wasn't alone in the dark. "You don't have to be here," Noelle whispered, her voice hoarse. "I know," Ezra said, but he didn't get up. And Noelle didn't ask him to leave. She looked at the man sitting on the cold bathroom floor at midnight, the mafia boss who led the Valenti family, the man who had just ordered 2 gunmen dealt with in a terrifyingly calm way, and she realized this wasn't the moment she began to trust him, because he was strong, because he had guns, because he had the power to protect her. She began to trust him, because he sat still beside her in the darkness, without taking anything away. Because for the past 14 months, every man near her had taken something, and this was the first one who only sat there and demanded nothing at all. After the attack, Ezra decided the penthouse was no longer safe. Not because the 2 gunmen from the night before had been a real threat, Gideon had dealt with them in 4 minutes, but because their existence proved that Conrad Voss knew exactly where Noelle was, and next time he wouldn't send 2 second-rate mercenaries. He would send Yuri Fedorov, and when Yuri came, 4 minutes wouldn't be enough. Ezra had a safe house in the western suburbs of Chicago, an ordinary 2-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood in Naperville, the kind of house whose neighbors assumed the owner was an accountant, or something close to it, with no one suspecting that inside there was a panic room with a steel door and a 360-degree camera system. Gideon drove, Ezra sat in the front passenger seat, and Noelle sat in the back. They left the penthouse at 2 o'clock in the morning, taking detours through 3 different routes to make sure no one was following them, and the car sank into the darkness of empty suburban roads, where the streetlights grew farther apart and the sky opened wider above them. Gideon focused on the road, his eyes constantly checking the side mirrors, professional and silent. Noelle sat in the back seat with her legs drawn up, staring out the window where the darkness streamed backward like black water, and she stayed silent for the first 40 minutes of the drive, the kind of silence Ezra had learned to read over the past 5 days. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of someone arranging words around something too heavy to say. Then she spoke, her voice small but every word clear, as though she had rehearsed this sentence many times in her mind before letting it leave her mouth. "If they catch me," she said, "I won't survive a second time." Ezra didn't turn around to look at her, but his hand tightened on the car door armrest. "Not because they'll kill me," Noelle continued, her voice frighteningly steady. Steady in the way only people who have thought about death long enough not to fear it anymore can be steady. "But because I can't bear going back to that cage. I can't bear hearing the lock snap shut again, hearing their laughter again, feeling their hands again. The first time, I survived because I didn't know how bad it would be. But now I know, and I know there isn't enough left inside me to endure it a second time." Gideon looked into the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Ezra's for half a second. Then he looked back at the road, his jaw tightening, because even a man who had seen every kind of brutality in 15 years beside a mafia boss still wasn't prepared for the voice of a 27-year-old girl speaking about her own death with that kind of calm. "I want you to promise me one thing," Noelle said. Ezra looked at her through the center rearview mirror. In that small mirror, he saw her face half in light and half in shadow, her eyes looking straight into his through the reflected glass. And in those eyes there were no tears, no fear, only the absolute seriousness of someone saying the most important thing of her life. "If I don't make it out," she said, each word clear, each word carrying weight, "find my mother. Her name is Nina Ashford. She lives at 1847 Hawthorne Street, Portland, Oregon. She's been looking for me for the past 14 months. I know that because before I was taken, I called her every night at 9 o'clock, and she would never stop waiting for that call." She paused, drew a breath, and continued. "Tell her that her daughter fought. Tell her I didn't give up, that I tried as hard as I could, that not a single day passed when I didn't think of her. And tell her I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't come home." The car passed through a dark stretch of road with no lights, and in that darkness no one could see anyone else's face. But Ezra felt something break open inside his chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, only a small, soft crack in a place he had thought had gone completely numb, because he remembered. He remembered that 8 years ago, when they found Petra inside a container at Calumet Harbor, no one brought him any words from her. No one told him whether Petra had been afraid in her final hours. No one told him whether she had fought or given up. No one told him whether she had thought of him, whether she had called his name, whether she had waited for him to come save her. For 8 years, he had lived with that emptiness, the black hole in the middle of his chest, not only because his sister was dead, but because he knew nothing about how she had died. I didn't know whether she had been in pain, whether she had been alone, whether anyone had held her hand. And now the girl sitting in the back seat of his car, the girl who would have been Petra's age if Petra were still alive, was asking him for one thing, not asking him to save her, not asking him to kill her enemies, but asking him not to let her mother live with the same emptiness he had carried for 8 years. A tear fell onto the back of Ezra's right hand, the hand resting on his thigh, the first tear in 8 years. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't turn his face to hide it. He simply let it stay there, hot and small against his skin, proof that beneath the concrete and steel he had poured over his heart for nearly a decade, there was still something left that knew how to hurt. "You'll tell her yourself," Ezra said, his voice rougher than usual, slightly breaking on the final word, but he didn't try to fix it. "I'll take you back to Portland. You'll stand in front of the door at 1847 Hawthorne Street, and you'll tell your mother yourself that you came home." "You can't promise that," Noelle said, her voice trembling for the first time in the whole conversation, because hope hurt more than despair, and she had learned to fear hope more than darkness. "I promise," Ezra said. 2 words. No explanation, no conditions, no "I'll try." Only "I promise," spoken in the voice of a man who hadn't promised anyone anything in 8 years, because the last promise he had failed to keep was the promise that he would find Petra, and he had sworn he would never promise again until he was certain that this time he wouldn't fail. Noelle said nothing more. She only looked out the window, where the darkness had begun to give way to the suburban lights of Naperville, and for the first time in 14 months, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she would see her mother again. In the front seat, Gideon Hale drove in silence, his eyes straight ahead, but his hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly than usual, because in 15 years, beside Ezra Valenti, this was the first time he had heard the crime lord's voice break, and he knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning at the safe house in Naperville, Ezra sat alone in the kitchen before Noelle woke, a cold cup of coffee on the table, his eyes fixed on empty space. He hadn't slept, not because he was worried. Ezra Valenti had stopped losing sleep over worry a long time ago, but because he was standing at a crossroads he knew would leave no road back. He thought about what Noelle had told them through Celeste, the 12 girls still alive, the 3 warehouses, the license plates, the schedules, the face of Judge Beau Whitmore. He thought about the promise he had made in the car the night before, the promise to take her back to Portland, back to her mother at 1847 Hawthorne Street. And he thought about Petra, about the container at Calumet Harbor, about 8 years spent wondering whether someone had tried to save his sister and failed, or whether no one had bothered to try at all. He knew what he had to do. The problem was that doing it meant breaking the most sacred rule of the underworld: never cooperate with the FBI. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Ezra called Tristan Gould. Tristan was the Valenti family's private attorney, 45 years old, a graduate of the University of Chicago, intelligent enough to be dangerous, and morally neutral enough to draft a contract for both angels and devils without blinking. When Ezra said, "I need you to contact Special Agent Walsh Carrick at the FBI," Tristan was silent for exactly 5 seconds, the longest Ezra had ever heard this attorney go without speaking, then asked, "Do you want me to record this call as legal counsel, so it's protected by attorney-client privilege? Or do you want me to forget this call ever happened?" "Record it," Ezra said. "I want everything legal from here on." Tristan arranged the meeting within 24 hours. The location was a conference room in the basement of Tristan's law office in the Loop, where there were no cameras, no listening devices, and attorney-client privilege protected every word spoken in that room from the court. Walsh Carrick came alone, wearing a coat, without a team. Because when a mafia boss wants to talk, you don't bring an entourage if you want the conversation to actually happen. Carrick looked at Ezra sitting across from him, and couldn't quite hide his surprise, though he tried, because in 20 years with the FBI, this was the first time a family boss had willingly sat down at the negotiating table, instead of being dragged there by an arrest warrant. The agreement took 4 hours to complete. Noelle Ashford would become a federal witness, and her testimony, along with the information she provided, would be used to prosecute Conrad Voss and Judge Bo Whitmore. In return, Noelle would receive full immunity from prosecution and be placed under witness protection until the trial was over. Ezra's part hurt much more. He agreed to provide inside information about Chicago's underworld, specifically the structure of Conrad's human trafficking network as he knew it through his sources. In return, the FBI would freeze part of the Valenti family's assets, and Ezra would have to completely give up the loan sharking operation, the branch that brought in nearly 60% of the empire's revenue. Carrick watched Ezra sign the agreement and asked, not as an agent, but as a man who was genuinely curious, "Why?" Ezra didn't answer. He stood, shook Carrick's hand, and left the room. But if Carrick was difficult to convince, Gideon Hale was the true battle. When Ezra told Gideon about the agreement, the man didn't explode in anger. He did something worse than explode in anger. He went silent. Gideon stood at the window of the safe house with his back to Ezra, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood beyond, where children were riding bicycles along the sidewalk, and he stayed silent for 2 full minutes. Then he spoke, his voice low and restrained enough that Ezra could hear every crack beneath it. 15 years. I followed you for 15 years. I killed for you. I went to prison for 4 years for you. I built every brick of this empire with you, and now you're burning it all down. Everything we built in 15 years. You sign one piece of paper and burn it clean because of a girl you met less than a week ago. I'm burning what should have burned when Petra died, Ezra said, and it was the first time in 8 years that he had spoken his sister's name aloud in front of Gideon. Gideon turned to look at him, and in his eyes there was something Ezra had never seen in his most loyal lieutenant before. Not betrayal, but fear. The fear of a man realizing that his leader had changed, and he didn't know what the new world would look like. Gideon said nothing more. He left the room, closed the door gently, and sat on the front steps, smoking a cigarette in silence. But news in the underworld moved faster than light. No one knew the details of the FBI agreement, but the rumor that Ezra Valenti was going soft spread through the family like wildfire. A crime lord bringing a strange girl home, protecting her from Conrad Voss, and now making decisions no one could understand. That was blood in the water, and sharks didn't need an invitation. Conrad Voss smelled opportunity. He didn't attack Ezra directly. He attacked from the inside. 2 middle-ranking subordinates in the Valenti family, the men who managed the loan sharking operation and were about to lose their livelihood when Ezra abandoned that branch, received calls from an unknown number on the same night. The money Conrad offered wasn't large, because loyalty is cheapest once it has already begun to tremble. Each man received $25,000 to do one simple thing: report Noelle Ashford's location to Conrad every time she was moved to a new place. Both agreed before the call ended. And that same night, at the safe house in Naperville, Noelle sat on the bed looking down at her hands, the hands that had once held a scalpel in a training room and now still shook every time there was a loud noise. And she wondered whether the man sleeping in the next room, the man who had promised to take her back to Portland, knew that this promise might cost him more than his life. Ezra didn't fully trust anyone in the Valenti family except Gideon, and after the rumors spread, his instinct told him there was a spy. So he played a chess move. He gave two different groups of If Conrad attacked one of the two false addresses, Ezra would know exactly which group had the rat. The plan was perfect in theory, but Ezra hadn't accounted for Beau Whitmore, the 61-year-old federal judge, the man whose face Noelle had seen at the Calumet Harbor warehouse 4 months earlier, wasn't someone who sat around waiting to be arrested. When Conrad called Whitmore and said the girl was somewhere in the Chicago area under Ezra Valenti's protection, and that the FBI was involved, Whitmore understood at once that if Noelle Ashford stepped onto the witness stand, his career, his freedom, and his life would be over. Whitmore had something Conrad didn't have: access to the federal court system, which was connected to the FBI database through record-sharing channels between the Department of Justice and the court system. He didn't need to hack anything, didn't need a stolen password. He only needed to log in with his own federal judge account and search for the witness protection file connected to the Conrad Voss case that Walsh Carrick had just opened. The file was encrypted, but the safe house address had been registered by the FBI as an emergency contact address for the protection team, and Whitmore found it in less than 10 minutes. Naperville, the exact address, house number, street name, zip code. He sent it to Conrad through an encrypted message and deleted the search history, but he couldn't erase the login traces in the system logs, the very thing that would later become evidence convicting him, but that was a story for later. That night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Noelle was sleeping on the second floor of the safe house when the sound of breaking glass woke her. It wasn't gunfire. Conrad had learned from the attack on the penthouse. This time he sent Yuri Fedorov and 4 other men, and Yuri didn't begin with guns, but with a smoke grenade thrown through the first-floor window. White smoke flooded the house within seconds. The camera system became useless, and in that chaos, Yuri moved with the cold precision of a man who had done this hundreds of times. Gideon was on the first floor when the smoke grenade exploded. He didn't run upstairs to protect himself. He ran up the stairs toward Noelle's room, because 15 years of loyalty to Ezra had taught him one thing: protect what the boss values most, even when the boss isn't there. Gideon ran into 2 of Conrad's gunmen at the top of the stairs. He dropped one of them with 3 shots to the chest, before the second man hit him twice, 1 bullet in his right shoulder and 1 through his left hip. Gideon fell, but he still blocked the staircase with his own body, firing 2 more shots that forced the second man back, buying maybe 30 seconds. But 30 seconds wasn't enough. Yuri had entered through the back door on the second floor, while Gideon blocked the front staircase. He kicked open the door to Noelle's room and found her already out of bed, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes wide in the darkness and smoke. Noelle didn't scream. She had lost the ability to scream a long time ago, but she didn't surrender either. When Yuri advanced, she lunged straight at his face, her fingernails carving 3 deep lines from his temple down to his cheek, blood wetting the Russian assassin's face for the first time in his career. Yuri was stunned for exactly 1 second, and in that second Noelle bit into the hand reaching for her throat, bit through flesh, and didn't let go until he punched her in the temple with his other hand. She still didn't let go. Only when he pulled a sedative syringe from his jacket pocket and stabbed it into her neck did Noelle's eyes begin to blur, and the last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the ring finger of Yuri Fedorov's right hand bleeding all over the floor, nearly severed by the teeth of a 27-year-old girl who weighed less than 105 pounds. 10 minutes later, Ezra arrived. He had been at the Little Italy restaurant handling late-night business when he received a call from one of the surviving guards. The safe house had been attacked, Gideon had been shot, the girl had been taken. He drove to Naperville in 14 minutes, breaking every speed limit on the interstate, and when he stepped into the house, he saw smoke still drifting along the ceiling, broken glass on the floor, blood on the staircase, and Gideon lying on his back at the foot of the stairs, his shirt soaked red, his face deathly pale, still breathing, but his eyes closed. Celeste Navarro arrived 5 minutes after Ezra, and immediately treated Gideon's wounds. He would live, but he needed surgery to remove the bullet in his hip within a few hours. Ezra stood in the middle of the safe house living room, where 2 hours earlier, Noelle had been sleeping on the bed upstairs, with the medical book lying face down on her chest. And now the bed was empty. The blankets were disturbed, and on the floor there were 3 streaks of blood, 2 from Yuri, 1 from Noelle when she bit him and split her lip. 3 Valenti subordinates stood in the room, waiting for orders, and not one of them looked directly at Ezra's face. Not because he was shouting. He wasn't shouting. His face held no expression, completely still, but something radiated from him that made the air in the room thicken like the sky before a storm. The kind of killing intent you can't see but can feel on your skin. The kind 15 years in the underworld teaches you means that when the crime lord goes silent like that, someone is about to die. Ezra looked down at the floor, where Yuri Fedorov's shoe print was still stamped into the thin layer of dust beside the pool of blood, then looked toward the broken window where the night wind blew in cold. He said exactly 1 sentence, not loudly, not quickly, each word falling into the silence like a bullet dropping into the chamber of a gun. Find her. Ezra activated every resource that 15 years of building an empire had given him. Every connection, every information line, every debtor, every person who feared the name Valenti. All of them were mobilized within 3 hours after Noelle disappeared from the Naperville safe house. He called people he normally would never call. Men at the very bottom of the underworld. Eyes and ears in every dark corner of Chicago that even the FBI couldn't reach. He didn't need to ask. He only needed to say his name and say, "Find the girl Conrad Voss is holding," and the network began to move. At the same time, he called Walsh Carrick. The FBI agent heard that Noelle had been taken and went silent for exactly 3 seconds, because he knew that the most important witness in the biggest case of his career had just fallen into the hands of the man he was trying to prosecute, and if Noelle died, the entire agreement would collapse. Carrick began mobilizing the task force. But he needed time, needed court orders, needed interagency coordination, needed all the things the machinery of law demanded, and Ezra knew time was the one thing Noelle didn't have. The answer came at 4 o'clock in the morning, from a cargo truck driver in the harbor area who had once borrowed money from the Valenti family. He had seen Conrad's car parked at warehouse number 7 in the southern section of Calumet Harbor. When Ezra heard that address, he said nothing for 10 seconds. Warehouse number 7 at Calumet Harbor. That exact place. The same building. The same warehouse. The place where, 8 years earlier, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on March 14th, harbor police had found Petra Valenti's body inside a 40-foot container, along with 3 other girls, none of them alive. Ezra hadn't set foot in Calumet Harbor since that day. For 8 years, he had avoided that area the way a man avoids a grave, because to him, that was exactly what it was. And now Conrad Voss was keeping Noelle in that same place. And Ezra knew it wasn't an accident. Conrad knew Petra's story. The whole Chicago underworld knew it. And Conrad had chosen that warehouse to send a message. "I know your greatest pain, and I'm keeping your girl in that very place so you'll have to come and face it." Ezra stood, put on a charcoal gray 3-piece suit, fastened the buttons, adjusted his cuffs. Every movement slow and precise, as though he were preparing for an important dinner, rather than for what might be the last night of his life. He didn't wear body armor. When one of his men handed him a bulletproof vest, Ezra looked at it and shook his head, not because he wanted to die, but because he knew Conrad would have men watching the gate, and a man in a suit walking in alone looked entirely different from a man in armor leading an army. The first looked like suicide. The second looked like a declaration of war, and Ezra needed Conrad to believe this was a negotiation, not an attack. Long enough for Carrick's FBI team to deploy the tactical unit behind them. He drove alone to Calumet Harbor at 4:45 in the morning. The sky was still black. Lake Michigan struck the concrete seawall in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, and the smell of lake water mixed with rust and machine oil filled the air. He parked about 200 meters from warehouse number 7, stepped out, and began to walk. 2 gate guards saw him and raised their guns, but one of their phones vibrated. Then he signaled for the other man to lower his weapon. Conrad wanted Ezra inside. That was part of the game. Ezra stepped through the rusted iron gate, walked along the narrow concrete path between 2 rows of warehouses, and each step on the cracked concrete carried him closer to the place he had spent 8 years avoiding. He recognized the smell before he recognized the sight. The smell of damp concrete mixed with rusted metal and standing water. Exactly the same smell as that day, the day he stood watching the container being cut open and saw Petra's hair before he saw her face. Dark brown hair spread across the cold steel floor. His steps slowed for 1 beat, only 1 beat. Then he kept walking. The door of warehouse number 7 was already open. Inside, industrial lights cast a cold white glow over the wide space, with a high ceiling, 4 concrete columns supporting the corrugated metal roof, and a concrete floor stained with old oil marks. Conrad Voss sat on a folding metal chair in the middle of the room, legs crossed, a glass of whiskey in his hand, 2 gunmen standing on either side of him, and Yuri Fedorov standing behind him, his face still marked by the 3 fresh scratches from Noel's fingernails, the ring finger on his right hand wrapped in white bandages. And in the corner of the room, about 5 meters from Conrad, Noel sat on the concrete floor, both hands chained to the column with a short steel chain, long enough for her to sit but not long enough for her to stand straight. Her left cheekbone was bruised, and her right eyelid was swollen, but her eyes were open, looking straight at Ezra as he stepped through the door. And in those eyes there was still something that 14 months locked in a cage and 12 hours chained to a column still hadn't killed, not hope. Hope was a luxury, but the refusal to surrender, the small flame Noelle Ashford protected at any cost, because if it went out, she knew she would never be able to light it again. Conrad looked Ezra up and down, the 3-piece suit, no armor, no army behind him, alone, and his smile slowly stretched like a crack spreading across ice. "You came alone," Conrad said. "Brave or stupid?" Ezra didn't look at Conrad. He looked at Noelle. He looked at the bruise on her face, the chain on her hands, the way she sat on the cold concrete floor. And he saw Petra, saw the container, saw the dark brown hair on the steel floor, and the circle of 8 years closed inside his chest with a silent click only he could hear. Then he looked at Conrad. "I came to take back what I bought," Ezra said. Conrad laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse, striking the concrete walls and bouncing back. $500, he said, swirling the whiskey so the ice turned in the glass. "You paid $500 for her at the black market. Now you're standing here, alone, without armor, inside the very warehouse where your sister died. How much is your life worth, Ezra?" Ezra looked straight into Conrad's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice didn't tremble, didn't rage, didn't fear. There was only the naked truth of a man who had finished every calculation and accepted every outcome. Less than hers. Everything began and ended in less than 40 seconds. After the words, "less than hers," Conrad hadn't even managed to set down his glass of whiskey before Ezra drew the gun hidden behind his back beneath his suit jacket and shot the gunman on Conrad's right in the dawn, chest before the man could raise his hand to his hip. The sound of the first shot hadn't finished echoing off the concrete walls before the second shot rang out. And the gunman on Conrad's left fell with a bullet hole through his shoulder, his gun flying from his hand and sliding across the concrete floor. The third man, standing near the rear door, lifted his gun in time to fire one shot that missed past Ezra's ear, before Ezra turned and put a bullet into the center of his chest. 3 men fell in 3 seconds. Ezra Valenti's fighting skill didn't come from a shooting range or military training. It came from the streets of Chicago's South Side when he was 16, from nights when he had to draw faster than the man across from him or not live until morning, from 21 years, in a world where every extra day alive was proof that you were faster, more precise, and more ruthless than the person who wanted to kill you. But Yuri Fedorov was not an ordinary gunman. While his 3 men fell, Yuri had already moved, quick and silent like the name he carried in the underworld, rolling to the right, taking cover behind a concrete column, and firing twice in succession. The first bullet tore into Ezra's abdomen on the lower left side, and the first sensation wasn't pain but heat, as though someone had pressed a red-hot iron bar into his flesh. The second bullet struck his right shoulder, turning his body halfway around, and this time there was pain. Pain so sharp his vision went white for half a second. Ezra dropped to one knee. Blood began soaking through the white shirt beneath his suit, spreading slowly and steadily, turning the white fabric dark red. But he didn't let go of the gun. 21 years on the streets had taught him that you let go of your gun when you're dead, not when you're wounded, and Ezra Valenti wasn't dead. Through sweat and blood, he saw Yuri step out from behind the concrete column, his gun raised, aimed at Ezra's head, and on the Russian assassin's face were the 3 scars Noelle had clawed into him, proof that the girl chained in the corner of the room had fought before Ezra ever arrived. Ezra fired. 1 bullet only, from 1 knee, his hand trembling from blood loss but still accurate enough, because at 5 meters you don't need a steady hand, you only need enough will left to pull the trigger. The bullet struck Yuri Fedorov in the chest, and the quietest assassin in Chicago finally became silent forever, falling onto the concrete floor without managing to say a single word, exactly the way he had lived. Conrad Voss watched his entire security team go down in less than 10 seconds, the glass of whiskey falling from his hand and shattering on the floor, and he did what every coward in an expensive suit does when there's no one left standing between him and death. He pulled a gun. Conrad drew the silver-plated pistol from inside his jacket, his hand shaking, because Conrad Voss was not a marksman. He was the man who paid others to shoot for him, and now there was no one left to shoot for him. He raised the gun toward Ezra, his finger searching for the trigger, but before he could fire, the clatter of a chain rang out from behind him, and the steel chain on Noelle's hands whipped around Conrad's ankle with every bit of desperate strength her emaciated frame could muster. Conrad lost his balance. His left leg buckled, his body pitched forward, and the bullet he fired veered left and buried itself in the concrete wall. Ezra looked at Conrad as he struggled to get up, the silver-plated gun still in his hand, and Ezra raised his own weapon. The barrel pointed straight at the face of Conrad Voss, the man who had operated the largest human trafficking network in the Great Lakes region, the man who had imprisoned Noelle for 14 months, the man behind Petra's death, and Ezra only needed to pull the trigger one more time for it to be over, for the 8-year debt to be paid, for everything to end. His finger tightened on the trigger. A part of him, the part that had lived in darkness for 21 years, wanted to shoot Conrad in the middle of the forehead and watch the light go out in his eyes. But then he heard Noelle breathing in the corner of the room, faint, broken, but still there, still alive. And he remembered the promise, not the promise to take her back to Portland, but the larger promise, the promise he had made to himself on the night Petra died, that if he ever had the chance, he would bring down the system that had killed his sister, not with a bullet in a dark alley, but by making them pay before justice, before the light, before the eyes of the whole world. Ezra lowered the gun barrel 20 centimeters and shot Conrad in the shoulder. Not the head, not the chest, the shoulder. Conrad screamed and collapsed to the floor, the silver-plated gun skidding away, and Ezra said, his voice faint from blood loss but every word clear, "You won't die here. You'll die in prison, slowly, one day at a time." Then Ezra's legs folded beneath him, and he fell, his back striking the cold concrete floor, his charcoal gray suit now soaked so dark with blood it looked black, the warehouse ceiling spinning above him, and he heard the sound of chains dragging over concrete as Noelle tried to crawl toward him. The short chain stretching so tight it cut into her wrists. But she didn't stop. She dragged her body across the floor until Ezra's head rested in her lap. Her hand touched his face, her fingers still stained with Yuri Fedorov's blood, and she said, "Open your eyes. You promised. You're not allowed to die before you keep your word." Ezra opened his eyes and looked up at her face, bruised, swollen, but alive, still alive. And he wanted to say something, but he no longer had the strength, so he only gave a small nod. Then he heard the sound he had been waiting for since the moment he walked into the warehouse, the sound of tires skidding over concrete, the shout of, "FBI, don't move," echoing from every direction, the warehouse doors being kicked open, and Walsh Carrick leading the tactical team into warehouse number 7 at Calumet Harbor, with body armor and tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. Conrad Voss was handcuffed on the floor, his shoulder still bleeding, his mouth still screaming for his lawyer. That same night, in Lake Forest, 40 miles from the harbor, another FBI team knocked on Judge Bo Whitmore's door at 5:15 in the morning and read him his right to remain silent in front of his wife, who was standing on the stairs in her nightgown. And inside warehouse number 7, Noelle Ashford sat on the concrete floor with the mafia boss's head in her lap, her hand resting on his chest so she could feel his heartbeat, and she didn't leave until the paramedics pulled her away to lift Ezra onto the stretcher. Celeste Navarro had arranged everything before the ambulance could even reach the warehouse. She called 2 surgeons she trusted, reserved an operating room at a private clinic in Lincoln Park that the Valenti family owned on paper under the name of a real estate company, and by the time Ezra was brought there at 5:40 in the morning, everything was ready. The surgery lasted 6 hours. The bullet in his shoulder had passed through the muscle and out the back, clean, uncomplicated. The one in his abdomen was the problem. It sat less than 2 centimeters from the abdominal aorta, and the 2 surgeons had to work for 4 hours just to remove the bullet without causing further damage. Ezra survived, But his body decided that surviving was enough for now, and closed every door. He was unconscious for 3 days. 3 days during which Noelle Ashford sat in the chair beside his bed and didn't leave for more than 15 minutes at a time, only long enough to use the bathroom and eat a few bites Celeste forced her to eat. She sat there, watching his heartbeat on the monitor, counting every beep, and whenever the space between 2 beeps stretched longer than usual, her heart tightened, because she knew that if this man died, she would lose more than the person who had saved her. She would lose the first proof in 14 months that this world still had someone willing to bleed in order to protect, instead of possess. On the 3rd day, at 9:17 in the morning, Ezra opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the white ceiling, the second was the IV line, and the third was Noelle, sitting in the chair beside him, her legs drawn up, dark circles beneath her eyes from 3 nights, without truly sleeping, but her eyes were open and looking at him. And when she saw his eyes open, she didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't call for a doctor. She only said, "You owe me a trip to Portland." Ezra wanted to laugh, but his abdomen reminded him that laughing was a terrible idea, so he only gave a small nod. 3 weeks of recovery followed. Celeste watched him closely, forcing Ezra to stay still when he wanted to get up after the first week, and Noelle became his reluctant supervisor because she was the only person Ezra actually listened to, not because she had any power, but because every time he tried to stand too soon, she only had to look at him with the same eyes he had seen on the balcony at 3 o'clock in the morning. Eyes that said, "I've lost enough, don't make me lose more," and he would lie back down. When Ezra was strong enough to walk, he kept his promise. He didn't tell Noelle they were going to Portland. He only said, "Get your coat," one morning. And when she saw the car parked outside with Gideon in the driver's seat, his right shoulder still bandaged, his face still pale from blood loss, but sitting there because Gideon Hale wouldn't let anyone else drive the boss anywhere in that condition, Noelle understood. She didn't ask. She only got into the car and looked out the window, and for the entire flight from Chicago to Portland, she didn't say a word, because there are moments human language was never designed to hold. 1847 Hawthorne Street, Portland, Oregon. A small 2-story house, painted white, with a low wooden fence, and a front yard where the rose bushes had withered because no one had cared for them properly in 14 months. Ezra parked the car about 10 meters from the door and turned off the engine. Noelle sat in the back seat, looking at the house, and for the first time Ezra saw her tremble not from fear, but from something entirely opposite to fear, something she hadn't dared feel for 14 months because it hurt more than despair. She opened the car door, stepped out, walked along the small brick path, and knocked. The door opened, and Nina Ashford stood there, 56 years old, thinner than the image Noelle had carried in her mind for 14 months, her hair much grayer, her eyes sunken from 14 months of looking at the phone every night at 9 o'clock, waiting for a call that never came. 30 seconds. For 30 seconds, no one said anything. Nina looked at her daughter and her mouth opened, but no sound came out, because her mind was still trying to process that the face in front of her was real, and not the 420-somethingth dream she had dreamed. Then Noelle said one single word. "Mom." And Nina Ashford collapsed forward, both arms wrapping around her daughter as though she were afraid that if she let go, Noelle would disappear again, and Noelle held her mother back, and both of them cried, not with quiet sobs or glistening tears, but with their whole bodies, the kind of crying that makes shoulders shake, knees bend, breath break into pieces, the kind of crying that releases 14 months of fear, 14 months of loneliness, 14 months of not knowing whether the other person was alive or dead. Ezra stood beside the car, 10 meters from the door, watching mother and daughter hold each other, and he thought of Petra, thought that he would never have this moment, would never open a door and see his sister standing there, would never hear Petra call him brother, and that pain didn't grow smaller. It only changed shape, from a black emptiness into something with light at the edges, because at least one girl had come home, at least one mother didn't have to wait forever. Noelle turned back, her eyes red, her cheeks wet, took Ezra's hand, and pulled him toward the door. He wanted to resist, wanted to say he didn't belong in this moment, but Noelle gave him no choice. She pulled him in front of her mother and said, "Mom, this is the man who brought me home." Nina Ashford looked at Ezra Valenti. She looked at the suit, looked at the way he stood, looked at the fresh scar on his neck where a bullet had nearly ended his life. And she knew who he was. Not his specific name, but the kind of man, because she had watched enough news and read enough papers to recognize a dangerous man when one stood in front of her. But she also saw something else. The way her daughter held his hand without fear. The way her daughter stood beside him without folding into herself. And she understood that whatever this man was to the rest of the world, to her daughter, he was the one who had opened the door. Nina took Ezra's hand in both of hers, her hands small, thin, warm, and she said, "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to me." Ezra's shoulder trembled once. Only once, so faintly that anyone not looking closely would have missed it. But Noelle was standing right beside him, and she saw it, and she knew that it was all the coldest mafia boss in Chicago allowed himself to show. He slipped his hand from Nina's, nodded, turned away, and walked back toward the car without looking back. Because if he looked back, he wasn't sure he would be able to hold himself together, and Ezra Valenti had spent his entire life holding himself together. 3 years after the night at the Calumet Harbor warehouse, the federal trial came to an end. Conrad Voss was sentenced to life without parole at ADX Florence Federal Prison in Colorado, the place reserved for the most dangerous criminals in America, where each day passes more slowly than the day before, and there is nothing but 4 concrete walls and silence. Exactly as Ezra had promised in the warehouse that night. You'll die in prison. Slowly, one day at a time. Judge Bo Whitmore was removed from the bench, stripped of judicial immunity, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy and human trafficking, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. The moment Whitmore was handcuffed right there in the courtroom, in front of his colleagues and the media, the image appeared on the front page of every newspaper in Chicago and became a symbol of what the justice system could do when there was a witness brave enough to stand up. That witness was Noelle Ashford. She stood on the witness stand for 3 consecutive days, recounting every detail her medical student memory had recorded during the 14 months she was held captive. Every name, every address, every face, every schedule. Her voice trembled during the first hour, but by the second hour, it was steady as steel, because she wasn't telling the jury only her own story. She was speaking for the 12 other girls she had promised in the darkness of the warehouse that if she ever got out, she wouldn't stay silent. 9 of those 12 girls were found alive. 9 girls were taken out of 3 warehouses, exactly at the addresses Noelle had provided, exactly according to the schedules she remembered, exactly matching the license plates she had written into a mind trained to observe. The other 3 girls were not found, and Noelle carried those 3 names with her every day, not as a burden, but as a reminder that she would never stop looking. Ezra Valenti paid the price exactly as he had agreed with Walsh Carrick. The FBI froze 60% of the Valenti family's assets. The entire loan sharking operation was erased. Dozens of foot soldiers lost their work, and the Valenti name no longer carried the same weight it once had on the streets of the South Side. Ezra redirected what remained into legal business, real estate and restaurants. Slower, less profitable, but the kind of money he didn't have to wash before putting it in the bank. He was still Ezra Valenti, still the man who made an entire room fall silent when he walked in, still dangerous in the way 21 years on the streets had carved into his bones, still carrying a past no sentence could erase. But he no longer needed darkness in order to exist, no longer needed to be the thing Petra's death had turned him into. Gideon Hale recovered from the wounds he had taken at the safe house. His right shoulder never worked completely the way it had before, but he stayed beside Ezra, because 15 years of loyalty wasn't something 2 bullets could end. And when Ezra turned toward legitimacy, Gideon turned with him, from mafia lieutenant into operations director for the restaurant chain. A new role, but the same old loyalty. Noelle completed the medical program that had been interrupted for 14 months, graduating as a doctor from the University of Illinois at Chicago, not Portland, because she chose to stay in this city, the city that had imprisoned her, and also the city that had set her free. She specialized in trauma psychology, working with victims of human trafficking and violence, because she understood what textbooks couldn't teach. She understood what the cage looked like from the inside. She understood what a lock sounded like when it snapped shut at 3 o'clock in the morning. She understood why someone could flinch when handed a cup of coffee, and why that didn't mean they were weak. She opened a free clinic on the south side of Chicago, less than 2 miles from the place where she had once been locked in an iron cage, and she named the clinic Petra's Room. Not her name, not Ezra's, but the name of the 19-year-old girl who hadn't escaped, because Noelle believed the best way to remember the dead was to save the living. Ezra funded the clinic, paying the rent, the equipment, the staff salaries, everything. but his name didn't appear on any paperwork. Not because he wanted to hide, but because this clinic wasn't his. It belonged to Petra, and to Noelle, and to the 9 girls who had been saved, and to the 3 girls who still had not been found. Ezra and Noelle stayed together, not in the way movies usually tell it, with no kiss in the rain and no dramatic confession of love. They stayed together the way 2 people who had walked through darkness stay together, slowly, carefully, with respect for boundaries whose value both of them understood, because both of them had once had the world cross their lines. Ezra never touched Noelle without asking. Noelle never asked Ezra to become someone he was not. Their love was built on respect, not possession. And if anyone asked Noelle why she chose to stay with a man who had a past like Ezra's, she would say that he was the man who had sat on the bathroom floor at midnight and asked nothing from her. And sometimes that is all you need to know about a person. Every year, on the exact day Ezra threw $500 onto the dirty ground at the Southside Black Market, Noelle left 5 crumpled $100 bills on his desk. No letter, no note. Just 5 crumpled bills, exactly like the first night. Ezra never spent that money. He folded the bills carefully and placed them in the locked drawer of his desk, beside the only photograph of Petra he had left, the tiny matchbox-sized picture taken on her 16th birthday, her smile wide, her eyes bright. Every year, the drawer grew heavier by 5 bills, and every year when Ezra opened it to place the money inside, he looked at Petra's photograph and thought that his sister would have liked Noelle, would have liked the way she nearly bit off an assassin's finger, would have liked the way she named the clinic, and perhaps, somewhere, Petra knew that in the end, he had finally not arrived too late. People ask me, Gideon Hale, why I still stay beside Ezra Valenti after everything that happened. I followed him for 20 years. I saw him kill people. I saw him build an empire from the empty hands of a 16-year-old kid on the streets of the South Side. I saw him turn the Valenti name into something the whole city of Chicago fell silent upon hearing. And I saw him burn it all down, burn 60% of the empire, burn 15 years of building, burn everything he and I had shed blood and sweat to create. But that night at the Southside Black Market, when he threw $500 onto the dirty ground to buy a girl he didn't know, whose name he didn't know, whose past he didn't know, that was the first time in 20 years I saw Ezra Valenti do something that wasn't for power, wasn't for money, wasn't for revenge, wasn't for any reason our world would recognize as reasonable. He did it because the girl in that cage looked like Petra, and he was too tired of not having saved Petra. 8 years carrying his sister's name like a wound that never healed. 8 years turning pain into power because he didn't know what else to turn it into. 8 years watching every young girl cross the street and wondering whether, if he had been faster by 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, Petra might still be alive. Then he looked into that cage and saw the answer. Not the answer to the old question, but the answer to the question he hadn't known he'd been asking for 8 years. What can I still do? And the answer was $500 thrown onto dirty ground, a cage door opening, a hand held out without demanding anything in return. People ask me, can a mafia boss change? I don't know the answer to that big question, but I do know that a mafia boss can choose. And sometimes one choice, just one single choice at the exact moment life places it in front of you, is enough to change everything around you, including yourself. $500, that was the price of the cage. That was the money Jonah Pruitt picked up from the dirt with greedy fingers. That was the money Conrad Voss laughed at because it wasn't enough to pay for his dinner. But what Ezra Valenti truly bought that night, with blood, with his empire, with 2 bullets in his body, with everything he had ever been and ever owned, wasn't a girl. He bought the right to be human, the right to look in the mirror every morning and not have to turn away, the right to think of Petra and not see only failure, the right to sit on a bathroom floor at midnight beside a trembling girl and demand nothing, and know that this alone meant more than everything power and money had ever given him. This story isn't a fairy tale. Ezra Valenti isn't a hero. He's a man who killed, who built an empire on other people's fear, who lived in darkness for 21 years. Noelle Ashford isn't a princess waiting to be rescued. She's the woman who bit off an assassin's finger and whipped a chain around the leg of a human trafficking boss when she weighed only 105 pounds. They are 2 broken people who found each other in the dark and decided they were tired enough of the darkness. And maybe that is the real lesson of this story. You don't have to be perfect to do the right thing. You don't have to be a good person to save someone. You only have to choose, in one moment, that another person's life is worth more than your comfort, that a stranger's pain deserves to be seen, that every human being in this world deserves to be treated like a human being, not merchandise in a cage. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself somewhere in it, whether in Ezra, the man carrying an old wound, in Noelle, the woman trying to stand back up after being pushed down, or in Nina, the mother who never stopped waiting for her daughter to come home, then I want to hear you speak. Leave a comment below. Share what you feel from deep inside your heart, what you think about this story, who it reminds you of in real life, and if you were standing before a cage door like Ezra that night, what would you choose? If you believe stories like this deserve to be told and heard, press the like button so this video can reach more people who may need to hear it tonight. Share this video with someone you think will feel it, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change the way someone sees the world. And if you want to walk with us on this journey of telling stories that touch the heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. We're always here, every day, with new stories, to remind one another that in a world that can sometimes feel too dark, there are still people who choose to light a lamp. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the very last minute. I wish you and the loved ones around you good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.